macro figure of international investment in the U.S.?
Well, there's something like $1.5 trillion of it, and that's not counting all categories.
And where does it go?
Well, talking about direct investment, which is, I think, our main topic, where foreigners actually control operations, it's mostly in manufacturing. About 16% of U.S. manufacturing is under foreign ownership.
Give some examples.
Well, the chemical industry is very heavily dominated by foreign investment. You have big German companies, BASF, amongst others, in that sector. The pharmaceutical sector, the automotive sector, we all know about Toyota, Honda, BMW, Mercedes, etc., with big investments in the U.S., but ones you'd be surprised at, the provision of food services. Sodexo, which is a French firm, used to be the food division of Marriott, but was bought by the French and is the biggest caterer in the U.S. So it's all over the place.
Is it good for the U.S. economy?
Well, it certainly is. Particularly in the high technology sectors, we can find evidence of technology spillovers. We can find evidence of productivity enhancement to the U.S. industry that comes through foreign investment. We can find that foreign investment has some boosting effect on U.S. growth. Foreign investors in the U.S. tend to pay their workers very well. In fact, most foreign-controlled companies pay better than their U.S. competitors in the U.S. There are exceptions, but that's generally the case.
Can you give an example?
Well, the prime example would be in the chemical industry and in the pharmaceutical industry, where you can go to government statistics and actually take out the payroll figures, and we find that the foreigners pay typically maybe 10% more than do equivalent U.S. firms.
Our guest is Edward Monty Graham. He is a senior fellow with the Institute for International Economics. We're talking about foreign investment in the U.S., kind of building on the port deal that we've all heard about for the last couple of weeks. But we wanted to find out exactly how much is invested in the U.S. by foreign firms, foreign governments, and where that money goes. Numbers are on the screen. We've divided them by political affiliation. Please allow 30 days between your calls. Remember that the area code is 202. You have to dial a 1 first. 737-0002 for Democrats, 737-0001 for Republicans, and 628-0205 for Independents. If you're living outside the U.S., if you're outside the U.S. now watching us, you can dial in also. 202-628-0184 is the number for you to call. journal@cspan.org is our email address. Is it mostly foreign firms or foreign governments that invest in the U.S.?
It's mostly foreign firms, private firms. In some cases, the firms do have a partial or whole government ownership. And of course, that figured in the Dubai Ports deal, that it was actually a private firm but under state ownership.
Is there another example you can give us of a current foreign investment that has some government overlays?
Well, ironically, one of the prime candidates possibly to have bought P&O had Dubai Ports World not bought it was the Ports Authority of Singapore, and that's also a state-owned firm. They control major port operations on the U.S. Gulf Coast and on the U.S. West Coast.
And so you think about, you're saying about $1.5 trillion has been invested in the U.S. in direct foreign aid.
Well,
actually,
something in that range, yes.
And what is indirect foreign investment?
Well, there's a lot of that. This would be holdings by foreign governments of U.S. Treasury bonds and bills. It would include private investment in various securities. It would include significant amounts of holdings of U.S. currency. That's actually a foreign investment in the U.S., just simply when the foreigners hold the U.S. currency.
Of the $1.5 trillion in direct investment in foreign investment in the U.S., about 70% of that comes from Europe, 14% from Asia, about 9% from Canada, and only about 0.5% from the Middle East. Where's it coming from in Europe?
It comes from all over Europe, but the United Kingdom is the major, the largest single investor. Significant amounts from Germany, from France, from the Netherlands, from Switzerland, from Sweden. So it's widespread.
And in 2005, $654 million in Middle East investment in the U.S. as opposed to $1.2 billion in 2004. Why is that going down?
I really don't know, and we haven't checked that out very closely. With the price of oil being high, you might expect there to be more. Actually, investment in the United States does tend to have a lot of volatility to it, and some of that volatility is just not explained very well.
Why?
Well, one reason is it's lumpy. Some of these investments are quite big. Dubai Ports World, of course, was quite a big investment, and so some of it is just timing. That if you have where you have a series of big investments, of course, if a transaction is recorded in a particular year, that'll shoot the figures up for that year, and the next year maybe all transactions are in progress and they get deferred to the next year. So you can get a lumpiness effect that creates volatility.
According to the Organization for International Investment, 5.3 million American jobs are due to are because of foreign firms in the U.S., 34% higher average salaries, and they tend to use unionized workers.
I think that's all correct. I think the important thing is that higher wage. I'm a little skeptical about the 30%. We've looked independently and find that it's more like 15%. But and I don't know quite where they got their figure on that. But yes, a lot of jobs in the U.S. are created by foreign firms, and they tend to pay significantly, actually better than U.S. firms.
Some of the foreign owned companies in the U.S. include the Miller Brewing Company. It's owned by a company in South Africa. Food Lion, it's owned by a company in Belgium. John Hancock Life Insurance is owned by a company in Canada. McCain Foods is out of Canada. Nestle is out of Switzerland, and Bridgestone is out of Japan. What's the environment for foreign investment in the U.S.? Is it welcoming?
It's been quite good. It's been quite welcoming. At the state and local level, governors and mayors, they just love it. They make trips abroad trying to get more of it. It seems to only be in the U.S. Congress and only sporadically that we have these flare-ups where we get this anti-sentiment that we've seen in the case of the Dubai Ports deal.
Now, Arab-based U.S. subsidiaries include Caribou Coffee, Church's Chicken, and Lohmann's retail stores. Who owns those? Do you know?
Well, very often these are owned by state entities. I can't tell you in the specific cases. There are something like thousands of individual foreign investments, and I don't know the specifics on each one of them, of course. But very often by state investment agencies, which the way things tend to work in the Middle East, the oil money comes in, a lot of it is collected by the state. It's held by the state beneficially, often in the name of the people, and invested abroad through various investment agencies.
Edward Graham is a senior fellow at the Institute for International Economics, which is what?
This is a private think tank, a research institute. We kind of think of ourselves as a university without classes. We do the research component, but not the teaching component. I also happen to be an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, so this is
and at Columbia?
I am in the fall at Columbia and in the spring at Johns Hopkins.
And who funds the Institute for International Economics?
We're funded by about 600 different entities, mostly private entities.
Business groups?
Most of them are business.
Are you considered pro-business?
We would be considered, I think, pro-globalization, pro-free trade, not necessarily pro-business in a classic sense of the word.
And with regard to the Dubai port deal, just FYI, what was your position on it?
Well, my position was that there was no major security risk posed by this investment, that ports is a globalized sector. There was and I felt no compelling reason for this deal to be blocked. On the other hand, I felt that there was some reasons for the sensitivities that were expressed, and frankly, I think that the White House could have done a far better job of having made the case that it wanted to make at a much earlier time than it made it. I think there was a chance that it could have headed off the whole issue if it had handled the issue a little more deftly than it did.
Let's take some calls. We're talking about foreign investment in the U.S. with our guest, Belmar, New Jersey. You're first up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a euphemism by the free traders who have let our free trade go up to $800 billion a year, which by and large gives these other countries or other corporations in other countries the money to invest in the U.S. My main question is, or statement, or let's see how this gentleman will handle it. Investment is nothing more than buying out the United States. And you free trade people, all you care is for this free trade, which is bringing us down. Free trade is nothing more than the outsourcing of U.S. workers and the value of our country is moving it out.
Thank you, caller. Got the point?
Well,
Mr. Graham.
Yes, I've heard this in many places, and I kind of wonder, given that, why is U.S. Unemployment so low? Why is it that U.S. direct investment abroad actually exceeds foreign direct investment in the United States? And that is the case. In fact, we buy more abroad than is owned in the U.S. Why is it that 4% of the U.S. is under a foreign ownership? Gee, the way I hear it sometimes you would think it was 90%. And why is it that these foreigners are providing these high-paying jobs for Americans if everything is outsourcing? We just said that foreigners create about 5 million jobs in the U.S., and they do so at good wages. And you're telling me it's all about outsourcing and losing U.S. jobs, and that's just not what the numbers say.
Flint, Michigan, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I think that there's a tremendous campaign going on in the country to get us aimed toward international trade. There are a lot of issues around this, but I would focus on the concern of the workers in America. I think we need to look at who benefits from these international trade, this international trade that goes on. The workers lose out, and we always hear the comment that we retrain American workers. But that retraining really is ineffective. I'm in the employment business, and I see people getting really taken advantage of for training, and we're talking years down the line and so forth. And I just think that the bottom line is the money's going out, the jobs are going out. The people the jobs are going to will not really buy American products. They won't support this economy. And we talk about jobs increases in this country. You really need to look at that. I really question some of these numbers. So my question is, really, aren't we looking down the road a considerable period of time before American workers really adjust to the outgoing of work and so forth that goes on in this country?
I had thought that the topic was foreign investment in the United States, and what I'm kind of wondering is how are all those workers employed by Toyota and by Mercedes in Alabama and by Hyundai in Alabama, how are they losing? We just said that they actually get a wage premium. They're paid better than other employers, other employees in the area. And you're telling me that American workers are losing because of the foreign investment. I think that's what you were saying. And I kind of find it hard to believe that these 5.5 million workers who are getting paid better than the average American are hurting all that badly.
Edward Monty Graham has a BS from MIT. He has an MBA and a DBA from Harvard. What's a DBA?
That's a Doctor of Business Administration.
And he's written several things, but one of the things that you've written is foreign direct investment in the U.S., and you wrote that with Paul Krugman.
That's correct.
And are you politically on the same page as Paul Krugman?
Not always.
Next call, Arlington, Virginia. Go ahead.
Hi there. I have two comments. One, just a comment about your screener, and then number two, I want to get to the question point. And the comment about the screener is, if you're living in Virginia, you're not registered Democrat or Republican. And when you call, which I happened to call last week, but didn't get through because of this, I said that I was a Republican. They said that, I'm sorry, that I was an independent voting Republican, and that's because in Virginia you're not registered Republican or Democrat. She refused to let me go through. Today I said, well, I'm a Republican because that's the way I vote and that's the way I am. But the point is that I think it should be explained to the screeners that in Virginia you're going to have some people who are going to be calling as Democrat or Republican but saying they're independent because they simply don't register by party.
Thank you
Now-
for that point. What's your point to our guest?
Yes, I think there's a big disconnect here, and I think the callers as well as the guests here may be stepping into this disconnect, and I would like to explain it. We're not concerned as Americans whether the investors are foreign or whether they're American. What we're concerned is when investments are in areas that affect security. We won World War II principally because we had access to oil and other resources, and they were not cut off because they were held by outside investors who had political interests that were contrary to America.
Well, I'm not an historian of World War II. However, I might tell you that at that time, a great deal of American oil was actually under foreign ownership, including, many people don't realize, the Shell Group, the Shell Oil Corporation, is under foreign ownership. The headquarters at that time was in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands were under German occupation. That fact didn't seem to, as you said, it didn't seem to prevent the United States from getting access to the oil. I always thought that in times of security, that our main defense in terms of keeping the commodities that we need flowing was the Navy and the control of the sea lanes, and not the legal ownership of the actual commodities. In a time of war, the President can invoke the Trading with the Enemy Act and other statutes to seize control of those assets where it's deemed necessary to do so for national security reasons. And as I say, I thought that it was really the Navy and not the lawyers that determined whether the commodities actually flowed through. But I could be wrong on that.
Edward Graham, are there other instances of foreign companies owning assets that might be deemed safety risks, such as the port deal?
Well, this gets very complicated, of course, because the Department of Homeland Security has designated 11 sectors very broadly as so-called critical infrastructure sectors. It's ironic that one of the bills before Congress would require U.S. ownership of all activities in those sectors, and I could tell you now that there is considerable foreign ownership already in those sectors.
Such as?
Well, in things like electric power distribution, where the British and the Canadians own significant interests. Even in things like public water supply, in some cases those are under foreign ownership or
like where?
Foreign management. I read someplace that there are instances in New York, for example, and again the owners are mostly Canadians, but Canadians are foreigners for these purposes. There's the U.S. ports are already very substantially under foreign ownership. In fact, I think most of the major ports are managed by foreign firms. So it's all over the board.
Is it easier for a Canadian to buy into America than it might be for, let's say, a Chinese or somebody from Pakistan?
Well,
are the rules the same across
the board? The rules are the same, yes. We do believe in national treatment in these matters. Now, in the case of an investment that triggers a so-called Exxon Florio review, where there is a national security concern, let's face it, as a practical matter, that a Canadian might have an easier time than a state-owned firm in China, and that's just a practical matter. But there's nothing in the law that would give a Canadian a higher priority. With the exception of a few security defense-related activities. There's nothing in the law that would give the Canadian priority over the Chinese investor.
With regard to the defense issue, is there foreign ownership of any defense sectors in our economy, such as?
Well, right out in Northern Virginia, where the caller comes from, there is a large operation, EADS, which is the European Aerospace and Defense, European Aerospace Defense and Space, I guess, is the company. They're actually the ultimate owners of the Airbus consortium, but they are defense contractors. British Aerospace is a U.S. defense contractor. And I think that the Pentagon has identified something like 400 firms that are ultimately suppliers to U.S. defense activities.
Our guest is Edward Graham. He's a senior fellow with the Institute for International Economics. Next call for him comes from Fresno, California. Good morning, Fresno.
Good morning. Yeah, this is one of the reasons I watch the Financial Channel to get the other kind of news, because it's so hard to understand this. It's, kind of esoteric to the rest of us. My question is, well, I have two. The first one is about the corporate charter and the nature of corporate charters, foreign corporate charters, as opposed to state-run businesses, and the nature of a multinational. In other words, is it an American company? Is it a multinational do all American companies, are they just located in America? That would be my first question.
Okay, thanks. We'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Mr. Graham.
Well, it's a complicated question, and I might say I'm not a lawyer. Some of your questions get deeply into the law. However, in general, foreign investment in the United States of the sort we're talking about consists of a U.S. corporation that is registered here in the United States under U.S. law, where the foreign ownership is through the common equity, through the common stock. So what you really have is a U.S. subsidiary of a foreign corporation, where that subsidiary, in fact, is a U.S. corporation, and the major shareholder is a foreign corporation. A good example would be in the U.S. there is the Toyota Motor Corporation of North America, TMC. That is 100% owned by Toyota of Japan. However, Toyota in North America is a U.S. corporation.
Next call comes from Hickson, Tennessee. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I was for the port deal. I called my my senator and told him. My question is, I'd heard on television that we have about $3 billion a day come in to the United States worth of trade a day. That's, first of all, my first thought, what I'd heard. Second of all, messing up this deal I heard on television could cause a depression like the 1930 depression. Now, I want you to look at me in the camera and explain to me, could this deal, if turned down, really cause our economic really to shrink and maybe go into a depression? Because it's so vital to us, because we're global. And people don't understand. We just can't buy from each other and make everything here. We've got to sell and purchase all around the world.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't think that blocking one deal would throw us into a depression. That's maybe the first thing to be said. I'm not quite that pro-globalization. If we were to start blocking a lot of deals, that would be quite another issue if this were to become the first of many. What you are probably thinking about is that many economic historians believe that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which brought about a high level of protection to the U.S. economy in 1929, may have been a causal agent of the Great Depression that ensued during the 1930s. And that is historically determined fact. And what many of these economists then are worried about is that a similar series of events, not a single transaction being blocked, but a number of actions being taken here in Washington, could have a similar effect. That, of course, would depend upon the premise that history does repeat itself.
Well, taking that caller's question one step further, the congressional reaction to the port deal, the transparency or non-transparency of CFIUS, how does this politically and economically affect foreign investment in the U.S.?
Foreign investors, of course, see things through a slightly different lens than certain U.S. senators. For one thing, they recognize that CFIUS is not as non-transparent as some of the senators have claimed. I think probably the best answer to your question is that, yes, that if there were to be a rash of legislation that were to come into effect, that were to make CFIUS more intrusive than it now is, that could have a serious chilling effect on foreign investment in the U.S. And exactly as the caller indicated, because of our massive current account deficit, we really do depend on foreign investment coming into the U.S. to finance that deficit. If that were to be chilled, that could have some very serious economic implications, including perhaps some depressing effect on the domestic U.S. economy.
Would a company like Hyundai opening up an auto plant in Alabama have to go through the CFIUS process?
Probably not. The CFIUS chooses which cases it believes are sensitive from a national security point of view. I would expect that that type of an operation would get a routine clearance.
And if you could explain the current account deficits and the holding of the U.S. bonds by foreign governments or foreign entities, and how that ties into the foreign investment in the U.S.
Well, as several callers have indicated, currently the United States does import more than it exports. And the net difference is about $800 billion a year, which is an impressive number. We have to somehow find the money to pay for that. And generally what we do is that we borrow the money, and we borrow the money essentially by selling U.S. securities, mostly Treasury securities, to foreigners. And that in fact is a way of borrowing money from the foreigners in order to finance the current account deficit. Foreign direct investment is one piece of that.
Next call for our guest comes from Albany, New York. We're talking about foreign investment in the U.S. Go ahead.
Yes, Albany, New York?
Go ahead, Albany.
Okay, I'm first-time caller, and I'm 47 years old. I worked in the Painters Union for over 25 years as a taper and spackler. My father was also in the construction business, and I think where things with this New World Trade Order thing, I think where the biggest problem is that we haven't brought the other nations along far enough for them to make a decent wage, where it's not there's not so much interest for them to come into this country and create jobs that pay way less. I mean, I'm paid $21 an hour, and I see where the unions are getting busted up, and now a lot of these non-union companies come in and offer $14 an hour jobs, while the $21 an hour jobs are disappearing. And I think that that's been the plan all along, is to get rid of the middle class and make it a two-class country. And I think that's where we're making a huge mistake. Thank you very much.
I have some sympathy with your point that income distribution in this country indeed is becoming more skewed. One way of saying that the rich are getting richer and in some cases the poor are getting poorer, the statistics bear that out. What I find a bit of a reach is you're ascribing that to foreigners. You said that you were in the Painters Union. I'm not entirely sure how foreign investment in the United States affects the Painters Union and how it suppresses wages in that particular industry, because indeed that's one where there is virtually no foreign investment in the United States. So I understand the problem that you're stating, but I really question whether you, by blaming the foreigners, you're putting the blame in the right direction.
Edward Graham has worked at the U.S. Treasury as an international economist. He was an administrator at OECD for a couple of years. He's been a professor at the University of North Carolina, associate professor at Duke, and currently an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins and at Columbia, and a senior fellow at the Institute for International Economics. Another call from Albany, this time on the Republican line. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Hi.
Yes, I have a comment and a question regarding foreign trade and foreign investment from Mr. Graham. And the fellow preceding me from Albany, New York, actually asked similar questions, but my question would have been, what wages are these Japanese automobile companies as Hyundai, Toyota, Honda, etc., what hourly wages are they providing the workers down in the South as compared to the workers around the Detroit area who lost their jobs? And when we talk about the employment rate and it's or the unemployment rate, and it's actually not too bad, 4.8%, I think, something like that. and the job growth went up $243,000, 243,000 people last month, and you know, but most of these jobs are in the service areas at very low-paying jobs. So, you know, what is the ratio between what the foreign automakers who are not making cars here, they're assembling cars from the parts made in their own company?
Got the point.
Well, in the first place, you're wrong on the last point. Many of the parts are made in the United States. Also, I might point out that Hyundai is a Korean company and not a Japanese company. But apart from those details, your question is a very valid one. In fact, as you might expect, in Kentucky and Alabama, the wages paid by the foreign firms are somewhat lower than the wages paid in Detroit. There have been studies shown of the trends, and in fact, in those southern states, the rate at which wages have risen in the automotive industry is faster than in Detroit. So in other words, that while there is a somewhat lower pay rate in the South, the gap has gotten very small. In fact, I think at the present time, auto workers in the South are paid at about 95% the level of the equivalent workers in Detroit.
Next call comes from San Diego. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. I just have a comment and a question like everybody. It just scares me to death the way Washington and the world throws the word trillion around like it's nothing. I mean, even $1 billion is such a huge number, but that's just my comment. My question for Mr. Graham is, I am supposed to be self-sufficient in order to survive. Is it a thing of the past that a nation can be self-sufficient with the global corporations, etc.? I mean, because if a human being is supposed to be self-sufficient, isn't it only proper that a nation can rely on itself and be self-sufficient? Have a good day. Thank you.
Well, I think that self-sufficiency on the part of a nation was an obsolete concept at the time of Julius Caesar. And in fact, I think you would find that within the Roman Empire there was considerable trade, considerable specialization. Moreover, I'm not entirely sure that you're self-sufficient. I suspect that you've had a job and that in the pursuit of that job that you developed certain skills. I question whether you raised your own food, whether you drew your own water. That might have been supplied through the public water supply, which is not self-sufficiency on your part. So I'll have to say I question your premises. I don't think any of us are self-sufficient, whether at the individual level or at the national level. Indeed, when we were self-sufficient, we were cavemen, and things have actually gotten better since those days. Chicago, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I just had a comment and a question. One, 70% of Americans we're not all stupid. We know there's a difference between owning car factories and owning American ports. We want foreign investments, but there should be areas that are clearly off limits. The question I have is, can you see how Hugo Chavez of Venezuela is using Citgo-owned refineries as a national security threat against the United States? And do you think the president should apologize for calling 70% of Americans racists and xenophobes? Thank you.
I didn't quite get all of your question. I did pick up something about Citgo and
Citgo
Hugo
being
Chavez.
a national security issue. The fact that Citgo operates big in the U.S. and it's Venezuelan state-owned.
Well,
and whether that should be a security
of course,
risk.
is a very interesting question. Actually, I don't feel it does pose a security risk because the U.S. refineries are under domestic regulation. The danger that is posed is if Mr. Chavez and Venezuela were to cut off crude oil supplies to those refineries, and that actually has very little to do with the actual ownership of the refineries. There is an issue there, and that would have to be granted. I think you asked what activities should be completely off limits to foreigners. It's a very, very good question. I suspect there are certain defense contracting operations that we would prefer to keep under U.S. ownership in spite of arguments in favor of trade, investment, and so forth. It's a little hard for me to envisage many others, and this is in part because, let's say, there's already extensive foreign ownership in the United States in many activities, and actually very little in the way of security concerns have been raised by this ownership. Things are working pretty well.
Pearl, Mississippi, you're on with Edward Graham. Go ahead.
Yeah, I question the statement about the higher wages that the automobile companies are paying. I live down here in the South, and if you get above the minimum wage here in Mississippi, you get a penny above the minimum wage, that wage is higher. Do you realize that this is the poorest state in the Union? And anything above the minimum wage is a high wage. It sounds good coming out of your mouth, but it doesn't sound good when you live down here.
I'm afraid I'm not quite sure that I understand your point. What I said was that automotive wages in Detroit are higher than in the South, but that in the South, that two things. One is that the automotive firms pay significantly higher than the average wage in states such as yours, and also that the wages demonstrably have been increasing at quite a rapid rate. Now, what you're telling me is that if you're paid barely above minimum wage, that's not a good thing. But what the data show is that the automotive firms are paying much, much higher than minimum wage, not just minimum wage plus an increment, but really, as I said, at something over 90% the levels that are paid in Detroit.
The Chinese company that wanted to buy Unocal a couple of years ago, that was struck down. This port deal was...
Let me correct that. It was
okay.
not struck down. That was CNOC. The shareholders of CNOC, which were state-owned, state-controlled, withdrew their offer.
Kind of the same thing as this Dubai port deal, correct?
Yeah, but it never got to review. It was never actually reviewed, that case.
And why are those two cases rising to such a level?
Well, that's a very good question because again, in the CNOC Unocal, there was no apparent security reason to block this deal. The Unocal oil reserves are mostly located in Asia and not in the United States, so we were not really selling massive U.S. assets. There were some stories about Unocal holding sensitive technologies. Those proved to be untrue. Unocal had no sensitive technologies for sale to the Chinese. I'll have to be very honest. There are some that would say that it's sheer bigotry, that it's okay for white people to invest in the United States, but not for Chinese and Arabs.
St. Helena Island, South Carolina, you're on the air.
Good morning. I would like to ask this one question. Have foreign investors or foreign governments actually bought American interstate highways, as some media reports recently have claimed? Thank you.
You know, I don't know. If they have, it would be toll operations, and I suspect that you would want to look to those sinister foreigners, the Canadians, as the buyers. I've read the same stories, but as I say, there are just thousands of foreign investments in the United States, and I don't know the details of all of them. But if there is a toll road owned by a foreign investor, I would not be taken aback or surprised. In general, the interstate highways are under U.S. control.
And I think that caller was referring to the Indiana State Toll Road.
Oh, okay.
Governor Mitch Daniels has it up for sale, and there's an Australian-Spanish consortium that is looking at purchasing that. If they do purchase such a thing, is that a security risk?
Absolutely not. It would be very hard for the Australians to wrap up the Indiana Toll Road and take it home so as to deprive Americans of use of it. If that were to be a concern in time, say we had war with Australia, I don't think that's too likely, but if we were to have war with Australia, under various statutes, that road could be seized and nationalized and put under U.S. control.
Time for one more call with Edward Graham, Atlanta. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for C-SPAN. I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome.
I wanted to know, first I wanted to make a comment that I think that if the administration's cause for going to war in Iraq was involvement in 9/11, then how could we turn around and sell a port to a country that was involved in 9/11? And my question is, when a U.S. firm invests in a foreign company, does that encourage outsourcing of American jobs? Is that a step toward outsourcing of American jobs?
Both very intriguing questions. The answer to the second one, and this is the problem I've had with several of the callers, is the answer is no. Generally, foreign investment in the U.S. creates jobs in the United States. It doesn't outsource them. There may be other activities that involve outsourcing, but this just isn't one of them. Now, on the matter of selling a port to a country that sponsored 9/11, there are two things wrong here. One of which is that Dubai and the United Arab Emirates did not sponsor 9/11. In fact, those are areas which the U.S. military uses quite freely and openly as a staging area for its operations in the Middle East. U.S. soldiers like to go to the United Arab Emirates. It's one of the places where they get a warm welcome. The government of the United Arab Emirates has been fully cooperative in the war in terror, and they absolutely were not sponsors in any sense of 9/11. It is true that two of the 9/11 perpetrators at one time were residents of the United Arab Emirates, but 9/11 perpetrators were also residents of, let's see, they were residents of Germany, the United Kingdom, California, and Arizona. I don't think that we're saying that California and Arizona can no longer invest in the United States because at one time 9/11 perpetrators held residence there. But that's much the same thing that some of the critics have been saying about the United Arab Emirates, that because two of the perpetrators once lived there, that somehow that the country itself was implicated. There is not a whit of evidence that the United Arab Emirates played any role whatsoever in 9/11. And as I say, in fact, they've been a very, very strong military ally of President Bush throughout this war on terror period.
$1.5 trillion invested in the U.S. How much has the U.S. invested around the world?
The U.S. in direct investment around the world has something like $200 billion more. We actually own more of the world in direct investment than the world owns of us.
Is it easier to invest in the U.S. than anywhere else?
Not necessarily. It's very easy to invest in Western Europe, which is where a lot of U.S. investment is held. These days, there used to be complaints about how Japan was a very hard place to invest. Japan is much more welcoming of foreign investment than it was previously. But the country that is surprisingly open, and many people don't realize this, is China. That China has about $500 billion of foreign investment in it, and a significant piece of that is U.S.
Our guest has been Edward Graham of the Institute for International Economics. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.